Okay, so this next section, we're going to talk about detailed maps. And first, I'm going to show you exactly what I mean by that. So we're going to go here. This is kind of the default first person. Actually, let me change this. Instead of just the normal one, let's do first person game mode. Say this is a first person shooter type of game. You're walking around and you have some of these like assets like these boulders and stuff. And sometimes you really want to get as close as you want to it, but you notice this looks kind of dingy, doesn't look like it's a lot of detail. This looks very muddy. It doesn't look good. And it might be because of limitations like uh because of an asset that's this size, you can only have it be like a 1024 texture, but then say you need to reuse it somehow and make it bigger. If it's smaller, it'll of course look better because we're shrinking the details down. But these assets are still static. So if I go back in here again and I'm like, oh, okay, it's not bad per se. But then when you look at it like this, it's like, yes, that of course looks really bad. You can basically see the pixelization of the pixels themselves. Well, you can either go in and change the texture resolution, and that of course will add in more details. But again, in most cases, say you're working in a console game, you don't have 4K textures. We're not at that point where we will be making assets with 4K textures. Not yet, at least. So what we could do is we can make a update to our shader. Let's see. Let's go into our basement, or I'm going to duplicate the one we just made. It'll be our base mat, and then we'll do detail. We'll change the name and add detail to it so we know that this is our base shader that we had made previously. And then this one's going to be updated to have a detail map to it. So what detail maps are going to be is they're going to be these textures. They're lower resolution, but they're going to be tiled a lot more, and they're going to be overlaid on top of the current textures that we currently already have. So in my case, I have this granite because the asset is a kind of granite rock. So we have a normal map and we have an albedo map, and I have them at 512 because you don't want to have, say, in this prop detail material, you're going to have maybe a 1024 by 1024 texture. You don't want to have another 1024 texture, or you don't want to have a 4K texture for your detail map and not have it be. You don't want it to have the detail maps be bigger than the actual prop asset itself. These guys are going to be smaller. They have to be more reasonable for performance. You're going to be tiling this a bunch of times anyway, so you also don't want to have too much detail repetitively added to it because it's going to make more noise and it's going to look really bad overall. It's the same thing like if you say like, oh, I want to add more details to my normal, and you just try to bump up the intensity, but then you realize that it's just a giant eyesore. So what we'll do is we can actually go in here, we can type in detail, and there's already this node already set up for that kind of stuff. So let's plug in our normal diffuse right here. And then let's plug in our normal. And then let me go and import. Actually, I can go right here and import. Oh, yes, it's in our downloads folder. Because I took this from Megascans. I went ahead already. I downloaded this stone granite, and then I, of course, renamed it to make it more, easily manageable within our project structure. So we have our two textures right here. Let's go here. And let's drag them in. And let's plug them in. Okay, so trying to plug in our actual detail diffuse does not work. And it's because we have this T2D. That stands for our texture objects. So a texture object is going to be a textured asset, but it doesn't have anything for texture details or any kind of property changing features. It's just going to be the asset itself. It's a cheaper way of adding in this texture file without needing to worry too much about the UVs and anything else. And we can close that out. And let me select this guy. And if you, another cool trick is, so if you actually have, I just clicked the content browser button. This, of course, will search up whatever's in your content browser. So if I go back, it selects the Granite normal map. If you have that asset selected in the content browser and you right click and you add in a texture object, it will bring in that textured object inside the slot already. So let's delete these and we will plug these guys in. And then we need 3 different parameters. So we're going to change one, and this is going to be our scale, which is going to be our tiling, basically. Detail tiling. Let's convert this one as well. Detail albedo intensity. Let's start, make sure we have our default value set up too. Convert this to parameter as well. Detail normal intensity. Okay. And don't worry about it saying diffuse. Unreal Engine was created at the cusp of PBR, so there's going to be certain terminology words that they've added in that aren't ubiquitous with PBR terminology. Diffuse doesn't always have to mean the old style of diffuse, it just means color map. So don't be confused by this term. So just plug it into base color, and then plug that into normal map, and then let's hit save. And then now let's go back to our materials. Let's make an instance. In this case, in this instance, let's plug in our 2 normal maps. Let me also grab the textures from this guy. Let's see. Here is our normal map for it, and here is our granite. Actually, that's not made. Oh, it's using basalt. So we now have our basalt. So let's hit play again. And you see, we already have the asset already applied. Now let's start adding and adjusting our detail normal. So let's click on these guys. Let's start playing around. So you can see that it is already tiling. It's just tiling once, so it's covering the entire asset. So let's tile it, say 10, 20. Let's change our intensity down a bit. Or let's turn it off and see. Let's do 50. Let's bring up our normal intensity a bit. So you can see we already have some details now added to the surface. Actually, let's just do 2. 245. Now let's hit play again. Let's get walking up close. And as you can see that we actually have some very, very close up normal detail. It doesn't change the overall silhouette or any of the major detail, but it's for this close up detail that, see, when you have an asset like this where it's using a baked in texture, you don't want to have this kind of normal information already baked down because it's a limitation already to it. In a lot of cases, like say at Sony Santa Monica, when they make rocks and stuff, they don't do any very granular fine detail like pores or cracks or anything like that. They only do the large and medium sized details of like the silhouette of the rocks, some kind of major shapes, but they don't really go too far into the details because they have shaders that do this same exact thing so that they can apply anything like detail maps or anything else to it. Because when you walk up to these kinds of assets in level, who knows, maybe this asset you don't even actually walk up this close. Do you really even need to have this detail map at this point? You have to think about how these assets are going to be used within a gameplay standpoint. In God of War, they're third person, so if you play third person, like say, let me change this. Move these guys. And you see, now that I'm walking around, you only see a little bit of this detail. Like, you only see that much. And just looking at that one guy, this one asset right here, just from this amount of detail, looks good. But then when you start doing, like, say, this is when you start seeing this kind of granular detail to it. So, again, this is just showing you an easier way to, after creating an asset, authoring, and instead of having to go back in and rebaking and adding in extra details and stuff, think about how this asset is going to be used over time. With this kind of shader, it allows you to move this guy around, resize it. Again, it's the same asset, so if you want to, you can go in here, you can rotate it, maybe you can scale it down a little bit as well. And of course, like, with this kind of asset, they've already predetermined how the colors and stuff are going to work. So it's not going to look odd that you're kind of combining these guys together. Because, when you start doing things like environment work, you're going to notice that kind of stuff. So of course, like, you go in here and like, oh, look at the details. The details look good. And of course, the same can be said for if you're a character artist. When you have assets like, so I have this example, it's from the game Kingdom Hearts. And I'm showing you this example because, one, I know that they, of course, are using Unreal Engine 4 for their gameplay, but this is their first time ever really using it. So I'm going to show you something a little later on called layer blending. And what it is using something similar where it masks out parts of an asset. Like, this guy has his skin shader, hair, his metal, and then you have like his leather. And then you're, of course, going to have other different types of like materials like plastics or whatever. But if you look at this, you can see the repetition of the detail map that they're using for this guy. So they've baked out a map that has like his wrinkles and this seam and this layering piece right here done. But then they don't want to add extra normal information over the asset itself. So what they do is they have this detail normal shader that they're repeating a normal of leather over it, just so that they can get this close-up detail to really fake the highly detailed look to things. Same thing with hers, but they're using a not so noticeable repetitive texture for her patterns. This is just unfortunate that they found a normal that just happens to have the details placed in a way that it looks repetitive over time. But that's kind of the basics of like a detail texture. if we actually wanted to, you can actually go in here and, maybe if you want to, you can create multiple nodes with a detailed, shader. Like, say, you can do one for rocks, you can do one for leathers, cloths, anything in general for detail texturing. You can, of course, move all these guys into their own material function and then just have those saved off and then just call material function whatever. Or if you just want to have it where you can just plug it in willy-nilly inside of this props thing, you can just go in here and convert these guys to parameters. You can actually make texture objects as parameters as well. Again, the whole texture object versus texture 2D thing is because you want these references to be not as bad as other texture samples you're going to have. A normal texture sample is going to have things like your UVs, normal texture properties, all these little things. A texture object is literally just the texture asset itself without needing to worry about the overhead of performance when it comes to worrying about UV and stuff. These guys don't do the UVing and all this stuff there. It's handled through something else like this shader node. So if we want to, we can go in here. This will be our detail normal, which of course I have to change the actual normal map because it's referencing the rock normal. Since hit save. Oh, and that's also, let me also switch out this. Let me change our detail diffuse and then our detail normal. That's the other upsetting thing is make sure you also have the texture selected when you do a convert to parameter, or else it's going to reference whatever you have already saved. So this is our detail albedo. And let's also do a new group, detail map. Same thing for this guy, and then same thing for these guys. So let's hit save. And then let's go to our instance that we had just made and pull them up. And then boom, now we have a detail map section for our detail albedo, detail normal, and then we have our intensities underneath each one, and then we have our tiling. Let me change that detail back to it. And of course, if you want to, you can disable or not even apply a detail albedo. Some people don't want to add that. It's the detail. That's gonna come around for things like you need to help break up repetition of certain assets, which in the following weeks we're going to go over better ways to break tiling repetition using different aspects of the environment and information that we can use to break up everything. So let's see. Yep, got that. Save, and yep, that's the basics of detail mapping.